Tag along for a ride as we closely examine and test the Iron Sleeve G5 cylinder by BGF. This is the 2019 upgraded version for a standard PK80. If you own a 66/80cc engine for a motorized bike, this is a video you're definitely not going to want to miss. Our test platform for the video is going to be a Zeda 4040. This is the same engine we rebuilt previously on the channel and has been lacking power ever since. The jug I've been using on this was not the original one that came with the kit, so I suspect any power loss might be due to the mismatched ports on this particular engine. Purchased off Amazon from the BGF store directly, this kit comes in at a reasonable price of $35 with free shipping, not much more than a standard jug might cost you. However, like every motorized bike parts, the reviews are pretty hit and miss. I'm hoping for the best, and I don't expect anything to go wrong, but there will be some surprises, trust me, there always are. The main purpose of this video is simply to test this particular iron sleeve cylinder, not necessarily compare it to other liners, sleeves, and different type of materials that are used. I simply want to know how reliable this one is going to be. From what I understand, the use of an iron sleeve in a cylinder is for longevity and reliability. I'm not sure if there is a performance gain, however I am interested in reliability as I've seen liners chip away on cheap cylinders many times. It's happened to me and it's probably going to happen to you, so the whole idea of using an iron sleeve cylinder is that we don't have to worry about the liner chipping away. As with any new cylinder, we want to check it for burrs, defects, clean up the ports, make sure there's nothing that's going to fall into the motor and muck up the works, and then deal with any glaring performance issues. I'm pretty impressed with the quality of the cylinder. It was a little dirty and had a couple burrs that needed to be cleaned up, but the machining was well done and the sleeve was properly inserted as far as I can tell. As far as the hardware included with the kit, I'm also impressed there. The studs are grade 8 quality with nice bolts, and the intake is well machined without a bunch of crap in it. Very little work would need to be done to this intake to match it to the carburetor. The walls are a little thick, so I might shave them down in the future. The intake port matching is not quite right, as the 40mm intake does not match the square port on the jug, but that's not necessarily a bad thing because the square port on the jug looks like it would match up perfectly to a diode reed setup with very little work involved. On the exhaust side, we have a pretty generous port. It does not match up well to the gasket that comes with the kit, however the gasket does perfectly match up to a stock exhaust manifold for your average muffler. But the wider exhaust port means that if you do upgrade your exhaust system, it has some potential to be unlocked. For head gasket choice, there's 3 options that I'm aware of. An aluminum one, which is included with the kit, a copper one, which is common and popular throughout the community, and then these brass ones, which I'm going to be testing for the first time. Spoiler alert, they work just fine. I didn't have any issues with leaking, and they didn't protrude into the cylinder. An issue I've had with some of the cheaply machined aluminum ones in the past is that they don't cut them out quite to the right dimension, and they'll sometimes protrude into the actual cylinder, causing the bits and pieces to get rubbed off by the piston, which is definitely not good. That's not to say that an aluminum head gasket is bad, just that the poorly machined ones are not the best. A similar story can be told for base gaskets, although the material choices are not quite as broad. I have noticed that I never can quite purchase one that matches perfectly to a jug or a case. They're always misaligned a little bit, meaning that you have to shave them off to get a nice smooth airflow. Really, it's not a big deal, it only takes a few seconds to fix, but I just make my own so I don't have to deal with that. And any performance you're going to notice from a smooth flowing base gasket is negligible unless you're really pushing out a top-end build. After removing and examining the head, the old cylinder, and old piston, I noticed superficial and very minor damage, meaning that there were many miles left on this particular combo, which was to be expected as I didn't have any issues with this motor, it's just a test platform. But to practically rule out as many potential problems from old hardware as possible, I will be using a new piston, rings, wrist pin clip, and needle bearing for this setup. On a standard G4 cylinder, which is what this is but without the insert, there's an exhaust bridge and a transfer port bridge. Both of these are there to help boost reliability. The exhaust bridge helps support the piston rings as they travel up and down through the port to prevent them from snagging and chipping away at the lining. The transfer port bridge helps give you a semi-open port design to improve airflow and performance while still supporting the piston. A lot of modders will go ahead and remove both bridges to get maximum airflow and increase performance while sacrificing the life of their piston. They're cheap, so it's justifiable. Unfortunately, it's a moot point because on the G5 cylinder, the exhaust bridge doesn't actually come in contact with the piston rings because the sleeve itself does not mirror the bridge. So it's just a restriction in airflow, which we're going to remove. It's easy on the exhaust side, it only takes about 5 minutes. Unfortunately, on the transfer port side, it's a lot more work. And we're going to go ahead and leave them in for now because if this cylinder doesn't prove to be reliable, that's a lot of work we would have done for nothing. But if it is a reliable cylinder, I will definitely take out the transfer port bridges as they no longer serve a purpose and just restrict airflow. As an extra precautionary measure, I took a bit of sandpaper and beveled out all of the edges on the insert, including the skirt and the ports. I want to make sure that there's nowhere for the piston or the rings to snag on the insert. As well as taking some degreaser and a rag to clean out the ports because I had noticed that before I had done any work to the cylinder, rubbing my finger through the ports exposed very fine flakes of metal. We'll be choosing the high hole piston for this build because the 4040 has the longer 40mm stroke. When installing new pistons, wrist pins, and needle bearings, it's always important to remember to oil these parts thoroughly while installing them. An issue that's easy to overlook when installing the base gasket is tearing. This section at the corner between the cylinder and the stud is always really easy to tear, and if you do get a rip here, you might as well just take it off and put on a new gasket because you won't have a seal between the cylinder and the stud. You'll have gases leaking through your stud. This particular cylinder was a little extra difficult to deal with because the tolerance between the stud and the cylinder itself is thinner than a standard G4 cylinder. Another thing that's always kind of a crapshoot with these cylinders when trying to match them to random cases is squish band. If you lack the tools capable of decking a cylinder, this is just something you're going to have to deal with. In this particular instance, this cylinder is not a great match to the 4040. Both in the fact that on the case itself, its transfer ports don't line up very well, meaning that you would have to do significant port matching to get a smooth flow, but also the fact that the head height on the deck is way too tall, meaning our squish band is going to be very fat and we're just going to lose performance because of this. The engine will still run, and as far as I know there shouldn't be any reliability issues, but we won't get very good performance because we won't have a lot of compression. On the other hand, this cylinder certainly looks like it has some potential to be unlocked. Now I can't say much for the transfer ports, but for the exhaust and intake ports, they open almost all the way with very little piston obstruction, meaning that if you were to significantly deck the head, add an extra base gasket, you wouldn't have to modify the piston in any way and you would still completely open the ports. Using my 5-minute rides to and from work to break in the motor on 20:1, 87 octane, and semi-synthetic oil, I didn't notice any issues and the motor ran just as it did before. No performance gains, but no losses. I've only recently got around to testing this cylinder, but I purchased it a few months ago, and when I did, I didn't have any knowledge for care and maintenance of an iron sleeve. This was before the Discord server really took off. I went ahead and asked some of the guys on the Custom Motorized Bike Facebook community for any tips they might have on the iron sleeve. Many of them suggested not using 40:1. They suggested staying at 32:1 with a high quality oil. They also highly recommended letting the motor warm up for at least a solid minute before putting a load on the engine. This is because the aluminum piston and the iron sleeve have different expansion rates and their temperature needs to really equalize before you start putting a load on the motor. I took these recommendations to heart and ensured that I let the motor warm up for a good 2 minutes before putting any excessive load on the engine. I want to make sure that we get the most out of it. After our break-in tank of 20:1, we switched to 32:1 and took it on a nice back road ride where we pushed it relatively hard. Not going all out, no excessive high RPM runs, as I still considered the motor to be in the break-in period, but we did push it harder than you normally would for a standard cylinder on the second tank. Here's some highlights from that ride, and once we're done, we're going to open up the cylinder, examine the piston, and see if there's any damage. Just going to give it a quick once over. Make sure there's nothing falling off the bike. After a few rides to work and back, and then a good 20-mile round trip on the back road, we brought it home, let it cool off, and then opened it up. So my heart sank in a fair bit of disappointment as you could hear the gouges on the cylinder wall scraping against my fingernail. This was completely unexpected and a major disappointment. I hate making videos of parts that I can't recommend because that's not as productive as recommending a reliable part. I'm not exactly sure why this would have happened either. I suspected any damage to be done to the piston and not the cylinder, as the piston's a softer aluminum, which is much easier to damage. But both the piston and cylinder had gouges on the exhaust side. Now, being only on the exhaust side tells me that it's probably a heat issue. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe one tank of break-in mix was just not enough for an iron sleeve, and I should have done a second tank before pushing it on the back road. But keep in mind, I wasn't really pushing it much harder than I normally would during a break-in period, allowing the engine for plenty of time to cool off in between pulls. There's also the possibility that I simply missed something. Maybe there was a chunk of metal or a burr in there that I didn't get. But I thought I searched the cylinder pretty thoroughly. I'm not sure, guys. But as of right now, I can't recommend this particular cylinder, but I'm not going to give up on it yet. Of course, I'm just going to keep running it as the motor was still running fine. And I'm going to see what happens in the future, how bad the damage gets. I might even consider retesting on a second cylinder with a longer break-in period and being a little more gentle. But the whole point of this cylinder is to be something that I can push without worrying about reliability. If I have to let it heat up for longer than 2 minutes, that's not practical. If I have to do an excessive amount of break-in, that's also not practical for new builders that simply won't know any better. If I missed something that you guys know I should have done or should not have done, let me know in the comments. Anyways, I checked the ring gap to make sure that that wasn't the cause of our issue. And as expected, both rings not only gapped within tolerances, but they were a bit on the high side, so that wouldn't have been a cause of the issue. I also read in some reviews for the cylinder that it was out of round for some builders, though when I checked it with my micrometer, I showed 47 millimeters on both sides of the wall. It's not a thorough test, but it was good enough for me to believe that the cylinder, as far as specifications, was not out of whack. The only thing I can think of for sure that I forgot to do was to sand and bevel the edges of the piston rings, which is something that's been recommended especially by the Zeda Motorsports guys. The piston rings are of subpar quality sometimes, and they're not machined perfectly, so they can have really jagged, sharp edges. Usually I'll take a bit of sandpaper and just run them along it to smooth out the edges. But other than that, I can't think of anything. Anyways, guys, I hope you got some useful information out of this video. Until next time, ride safe.